Hi, we come to 1 Samuel 24, which we're going to look at as a unit with three chapters, 1 Samuel 24, 25, and 26. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, there's some key questions for interpreting how these chapters fit together. And I can say, having reviewed the literature that was available to me from recent scholarship, scholars are all over the place on some of these questions. So I'm not going to propose there are right answers. I will say which ones I think are most likely or less likely, but you can decide for yourself from the sources we'll look at, and I'll share some of those sources with you as we go. So in this initial video, I'm just going to try to introduce some of the themes and the questions that we'll look at in detail as we go through these chapters. So first of all, as you can see on the right side, the first central question is, what is the relationship between the stories of David and Saul's chase in 1 Samuel 24 and 1 Samuel 26? And as part of that question, there are three sub-questions, and there are many more, but I'm trying to reduce this to something relatively simple. Are there two authors or one? Based on some of the questions we've been looking at throughout the entire Samuel story, and as part of the larger narrative of the Deuteronomic history, which is to say all the books from Joshua to 2 Kings. And I'm not going to wade into that any more now than I have previously, except to say that scholars argue about it greatly. And one of the issues here is whether not just the overall Samuel story of whether it's written contemporaneous with the time of David or some much later, centuries later, justification for another situation. But here scholars argue about whether this question has to do with the end of the monarchy altogether, not just the end of Saul, but the end of the monarchy, which would put it in a time of exile or post-exile under Persian control. And we'll see that that's a possibility, at least for part of it, that we'll look at. I don't tend to try to divide these passages up into some that are from one time period and some that are from another, but as we'll see when we look at details, there are some key words that are rare in these passages that do suggest late composition related to the question of the end of monarchy after the monarchy had actually fallen. That is the question of restoring the monarchy, as Genesis addresses and Ezra Nehemiah address and other texts from the exilic period. So that's one we'll look at around the question of two authors or one. And that's also related to the question of the time of composition of either or both of chapter 24 and 26, which is to say, is one written earlier and one written later, much later, say, maybe a century or two later, to make a different point, as scholars have argued about Genesis in terms of a Yahwist or an Elohist or a priestly author writing versions of the stories over a different time? Or is it one author, or different authors perhaps at the same time? And as I've noted, is the context the succession narrative, the question of David succeeding Saul, or the exilic narrative of what succeeds monarchy after exile? And similarly, there's a question of, is this one incident or two? And we won't be able to answer that in advance. We'll have to look at it in the details. The stories certainly have parallels, as we'll look at in just a moment, but there are also major differences, as we'll see as well. So let's begin to look at some of the aspects of this first question, the relationship between chapter 24 and chapter 26, before we get to its relationship with the Nabal and Abigail scene in chapter 25. So here are some of the connections in terms of words, and I know that print is very small, but I wanted you to be able to see both chapters in full, so you can at least see the color-coded pieces that match. This initial piece is actually before chapter 24, as you can see, from 23:19, but almost verbatim to the introduction of chapter 26. But there are a number of very parallel things, including the unusual element of David calling himself, in terms of Saul chasing him, a single flea here and a single flea there, and it's the only time a flea is mentioned anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. So certainly these stories are in relationship to each other. The question is, which is which? More recent scholarship, including from Cynthia Edenberg, whose chart I'll show you in just a moment, argues that 26 came first and 24 is a rewriting of that, but she doesn't try to claim why the author would leave traces in chapter 24 of elements that seem to suggest they're out of place there from her interpretation. Why would they be doing that? So that's something we have to take account of, not just is there multiple authors or are they related, but why are they both here? So we can certainly see the parallels here. But the question of why they're both here, I'd like to suggest, and many scholars agree with this, although it leaves aside for the moment the question of why these aren't exactly parallel, why there are similarities and differences, are the links between these and the story in between them in chapter 25. Before we look at that, let's look a little bit at what Edenberg shows as themes that connect these things. And I realize that because she uses the Hebrew, many of you can't read it, so don't worry about that. You can at least see the chapters and verses. And she uses commas where I use periods, so that's confusing. This is chapter 24, verse 4. It's an older way of doing it, although this article is from 2012, so it's not that old, but she uses the older way. But the main point is just to see the narrative elements here. And I won't go over them all in detail now. We'll see them and go through them as we go through the chapters in detail. But you can see that she's not looking at exact words, although she does note the underlined elements here where the words are similar. And even if you can't read the Hebrew, you can see the parts where they're underlined and see at least where the shapes are similar. But the thematic elements, that the stories follow a very similar pattern here, as you can see throughout. So there's no question about those relationships. But the relationship between those two chapters, which is to say 24 and 26, and the one in the middle of 25, are major. And I want to go over this in a little more detail so that as we start the 3 chapters, focusing on chapter 24, we can hear that they're echoing back and forth with each other, and we should really be able to listen to them all at one time. It's something like when I was beginning to study the Gospel of John some 3 decades ago, one of the scholars whose work I read was saying, reading any passage of the Gospel of John is relatively easy once you understand the whole thing, which is a little bit of an intellectual scholarly joke, but the same thing is true here. Any individual part of 1 Samuel 24 to 26 will make more sense when we've gone through the whole thing. So I would encourage you to pay attention to what I'm doing here, and if you're interested, maybe go back over it again when we're done. So let's just look at some of the parallels here. So we see in the beginning of chapter 25, Nabal's home is at a town called Maon, which is otherwise not relevant to the story. It's never mentioned again. But David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon just before this scene here. Nabal has 3,000 sheep, and Saul took 3,000 chosen men. And Nabal also had 1,000 goats. And interestingly, David hides in the rocks with the wild goats. So they certainly start in a similar area, a similar situation there. Here's one we'll look at in more detail when we get to chapter 25. But Nabal is called a Calebite, which has 2 possibilities. Either he's a member of the tribe of Caleb, the one person who survives the time from Exodus into the Promised Land. Moses doesn't, just Caleb. Or the meaning of it, which is dog. And so we can see that on the right side here from 24:14, David is saying to Saul, "Whom do you pursue? A dead dog," which is Caleb. And as Edinburgh notes, and others have noted, the form here, Kalebi, is not really the form for an ethnic element, so it's much more likely that it's meant to be a way of talking about him, that he's a dog, or he's, as some have said, from the tribe of dogs. And that's telling us something almost right away here, because I didn't mention it yet, but the word Nabal means fool. And as we'll see in another comparison, Nabal is the exact opposite of Laban in English and in Hebrew, a character that Jacob is sent to, his uncle, to get a wife, and that will also relate to this. So we'll look at that a little later, not today on this video, of the relationship between 1 Samuel 25 and the Laban story. So that's an element there. But his name as a dog and his name meaning Nabal, meaning fool, suggests that these are not real names, that these are nicknames, that he's known as a fool or a dog, or that this story is meant to be an allegory or some kind of parable, following the work of Robert Polzin, who, as we'll see in 2 Samuel, highlights the story, the plainly parabolic story that Nathan tells David in 2 Samuel 7 about a rich man, a poor man, a ewe lamb, and a traveler. And as I wrote in my book, Come Out My People, a similar kind of parable in terms of Solomon's negotiating the maternity suit between the 2 street prostitutes in 1 Kings 3. So Polzin suggests that the writers of the David story are often telling stories that don't appear to be parables but actually are, unlike the rich man, the poor man, and the traveler, which is plainly a parable, and also like the wise woman of Endor in 2 Samuel 14, who tells a story about 2 sons who fight in the field that sounds a lot like the Adam and Eve story, but is meant to be about Absalom and Amnon, and plainly is a parable. So sometimes the stories in these passages and in these books are openly parables, or at least parables as soon as the character figures that out, and some are left for the reader to figure out. So one option is that chapter 25 is a parable interpreting the reign of Saul. Another is that it's a dream of Saul, because in the beginning of chapter 26 we'll hear that Saul had a deep sleep put on him from Yahweh. And so perhaps this is Saul's dream of what is happening as he awaits David, or is afraid of David, that David might take over and kill him, as we'll see in the story. So we can read that a number of ways. Then we see the parallels here with peace, that David greets Nabal 3 with a triple peace, and we'll see when we get to chapter 25, it's a chapter full of triple notices here. 3 times in the same word, but also 3 explanations or 3 possibilities in a number of places. The use of son David, which is certainly key here, that Saul refers to David twice as my son David, even though plainly David is not his son. And the last time we saw them, Saul was not very positively imposed upon David or upon his son Jonathan, who he called a bad name about his mother, which is to say Saul's own wife, for Jonathan's choosing to side with David over against Saul. So Saul speaking suddenly tenderly and affectionately about David is an unusual thing, but it echoes here, son David in 25:8. Nabal's statement, there are many servants today breaking away from their Lord, certainly echoes that 27 of 38 uses of the Hebrew for Lord, Adon, in 1 Samuel are in these 3 chapters. So 3/4 of it are in 3 chapters that represent only 10% of the first book of Samuel. David says about Nabal, he's returned me evil for good, and Saul says to David, you have repaid me good, whereas I repaid you evil. Again, almost identical phrases. Then another interesting parallel, and pious readers of the Bible may be a little embarrassed about this, but the authors are certainly not, and we'll see there's more sexual innuendo. So David says, God, do so to David and more, if by morning I leave so much as one who pisses against the wall, which is to say of Nabal's men. And that's parallel to Saul going to relieve himself in the cave, described as covering his feet, so not in explicit scatological terms, but it's certainly understood that way. So there's both pissing and shitting going on in these 2 stories. Abigail falls on her face before David, bowing to the ground, as David falls on his face and bows to the ground before Saul. And then Abigail, in her long speech, the longest speech of a woman anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, says, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be like Nabal. And in both passages, in 24 and in 26, David's men, and more specifically Abishai, say a similar thing. God has given your enemy into your hand. A point that David will dispute when we get there, but we'll get there when we get there. Abigail also says, please forgive the trespass, using the Hebrew pesha of your servant. And in this other passage, in chapter 24, David says that he cut off the corner of Saul's cloak and did not kill you, so you may know for certain there is no evil or trespass. I left out the verse there, but I'll put it in before this is final. And note that the word pesha is only in these 2 places in 1 Samuel. Then unusual word here, using Adam for a man, as opposed to either Ish, the male person, or the more generic words for human beings in general, or Nefesh for life. Specifically Adam. If a man, Adam, should rise up to pursue you and to seek your life. And all 3 elements of this are parallel. The use of Adam, which is relatively unusual, for the same purposes, not just Adam, but a man to rise up to pursue you and seek your life. And here David said to Saul, a man urged me to kill you. And the pursue is followed here, and the seeks to do harm to seek your life is there. So seeking, pursuing, and the man are all parallel there. David says to Abigail at the end of her speech, blessed be your good sense and blessed be you. And then Saul says to David at the end of David's long speech, blessed be you, my son David. So both of them are in a sense converted by the speech of the other, away from violence. David says to Abigail in the postscript, Yahweh has restrained me from hurting you, using the word for ra, for evil. And I could have translated it that way, but I wanted to highlight that we have to look behind the translations to note the parallels sometimes, because in the New RSV has hurting here, but harm here for the same word. So Saul says, I have done wrong, come back, my son David, for I will never harm you again, as David promises not to harm Abigail, or has not. And then an interesting parallel, that's somewhat verbal but also thematic. Nabal, which means fool, was holding a feast like a king, and Saul the king acknowledges he's been a fool. And then finally, after 10 days, Yahweh struck Nabal down and he died, and David says, as Yahweh lives, Yahweh will strike him down, using the same word. So we see many, many parallels there. So it's really important that we read these together. We not only see parallels, as we saw, between 24 and 26, but also these parallels between 25 and the surrounding verses. Another element that we won't look at right now, but I'll just show you here, because I already noted it, was the parallels with the Jacob and Laban story in Genesis. And I won't go over these all now. I'll post it on the webpage as I do, but we can look at those later as we go. So as we enter into the story when Saul returned from following the Philistines, I hope you can keep these elements in mind, and as we go through the videos of the individual components, I'll be bringing up some of these connections. So if you haven't watched this video, or you watched it at one point and you watch the others later, you can be reminded of that as we go. All right, so with our next video, we'll jump right into the story. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.